Hello everyone, in this video we'll be covering Chapter 4, Economic Efficiency, Government Price Setting, and Taxes. We'll be spending the majority of our time in this chapter talking about consumer and producer surplus and how government intervention in the market through price floors and ceilings impacts consumer and producer surplus respectively. We'll also briefly talk about the economic effect of taxes, but that won't be heavily tested. So if you do struggle understanding that concept, I wouldn't worry too much about it. Before we get started, the example in the PowerPoint talks about food riots in Venezuela and the rise of ride-sharing services in the United States. What do those two things have in common? Well, both situations involve governments attempting to alter prices. So, with that being said, we can see those two examples as related to what we will be talking about when we discuss government intervention in competitive markets. So let's go ahead and get started. First thing we're going to be talking about is consumer surplus, and then we'll move on to producer surplus. Just like we talked about demand and supply, we're talking about the consumer versus the producer. Keep in mind, surplus is the extra above what is used or needed. Economists think about surplus in terms of what is the benefit people derive from exchanging goods and services in a market. So consumer surplus, or what I'll refer to as CS for short, is the difference between the highest price a consumer is willing to pay for a good or service and the actual price that the consumer pays. So the example we'll be using here is talking about the chai tea market, again, borrowed from the PowerPoint. If we were doing this in person, I may actually create my own market for something, but for simplicity's sake, we'll just use what the PowerPoint has. So in this market, we have 4 different consumers: Teresa, Tom, Terry, and Tim, and they're characterized by the highest price they're willing to pay for a cup of chai tea. So here we have a chart that shows that, and then we have that chart graphed out that shows the price in dollars per cup and the quantity in cups per day. So we can see on this chart, at a price above $6, no chai tea is going to be sold. At a price of $6, 1 cup will be sold, and as the price falls, more cups will be sold respectively. So our question is, how much potential benefit do tea consumers derive from this market? So how much benefit does Teresa, Tom, Terry, and Tim collectively receive from this market? So what this depends on is the price and their marginal benefit. Marginal benefit is the additional benefit to a consumer from consuming one more unit of a good or service. So if the price is low, obviously many consumers are going to benefit. If the price is high, there's not as many consumers who will benefit, if any, for that matter. So for example's sake, let's say that the price of chai tea is going to be $3.50 for a cup. And so at price $3.50, let's see who is willing to buy a cup of tea. So if we set the price at $3.50, Teresa, Tom, and Terry are willing to buy a cup of tea. Teresa is willing to pay $6. Tom is willing to pay $5. Terry is willing to pay $4. So in order to calculate the net benefit each consumer is deriving, we need to find the area of A, B, and C, those areas respectively, and that represents the net benefit or consumer surplus each person is receiving in the market. So another way to think about this is, what is the difference between what they are willing to pay and what they actually pay, multiplied by how many cups they are purchasing. So in this case, in order to get Teresa's consumer surplus, we would take 6 minus 350 times 1 cup of tea equals 250, which I went ahead and wrote up here. So that's for area A. For area B, you would take 5 minus 350, the actual price they're willing to pay. So this is Tom's consumer surplus times the 1 cup of tea Tom is purchasing equals 150. And then respectively, you would continue it. So for area C, which is Terry's consumer surplus, that would be $4 minus 350 times 1 cup of tea equals 50 cents. Okay? So in order to calculate the entire net benefit, we would sum up the areas of A, B, and C, and that would represent the consumer surplus in the entire chai tea market. So consumer surplus is going to be equal to the total amount of areas A, B, and C added up. You can see that Tim, he would receive 0 consumer surplus because he is not willing to pay for a cup of chai tea at the given price. So going back to chapter 3, when we defined the demand curve and what it showed, remember the demand curve, it showed us what consumers were willing to pay or how much consumers were willing to purchase at a given price. In this case, what is this stair-stepped curve representative of? It's the demand curve. So consumer surplus is described as the area below the demand curve and above the price consumers pay. So eventually, if we took a survey of a large number of consumers, say 1,000 consumers, and their willingness to pay for a certain good or service, what would happen is our stair-stepped looking graph would eventually turn into a linear looking graph. And that's where calculus comes into play once you look at some higher level economics courses. In order to derive the curve, you can use mathematical formulas, and we're not going to get into that, but I just wanted to kind of link that in case you see it later on. But the important thing is for you to understand that the demand curve tells us at different prices, the quantity demanded consumers are willing to pay within a market. Excuse me, the demand curve shows us at different prices the quantity of goods and services consumers are willing to purchase at that specific price. And so consumer surplus is going to be the area below the demand curve and above the price that consumers pay. Here we can see if we look at the tea market as a whole, because the market is larger than just our 4 consumers, we're going to derive a demand curve that looks like a normal straight line, a normal downward sloping demand curve, and consumer surplus will be defined in the same way. Here, our price has fallen to $2, and so you can use the formula 1/2 base times height to calculate the area of a triangle. and to calculate consumer surplus. So, okay, here it's just an important last note. Consumer surplus, total consumer surplus equals the area below the demand curve above the price. That's what I just said. It also measures net benefit rather than total benefit. Okay. So before we move on to producer surplus, if we apply the concept to Uber, especially in large cities, ride-sharing services are beneficial to consumers. How would we determine how beneficial it is? How much consumer surplus would be derived in the ride-sharing market? We would have to know the demand curve for Uber services, and we would have to know the price of Uber services. Okay. So now let's move on to producer surplus. Remember, producer surplus can be thought of in the same way as consumer surplus, but we're looking at it from the producer perspective. So similar to supply side versus the demand side, we're having a producer side versus the consumer side. Producer surplus, it is the difference between PS is the difference between the lowest price a firm would be willing to accept for a good or service and the price that it actually received. So from a producer perspective, at what price are we willing to provide a good or service? What's the lowest possible price, and what price can we charge for it? And remember, the difference between that would be the profit, essentially, if you were considering that the lowest price a firm would be willing to accept would be cost. So again, what is the lowest cost a firm would be willing to accept for a good or service? That would be the marginal cost. Marginal cost is the additional cost to a firm of producing one more unit of a good or service. So we introduced marginal cost versus marginal benefit once more. Here in the related to the concept of what is the minimum price a business is willing to sell their good or service at. It'd be the additional cost would be the minimal price they'd be willing to sell at. Okay? So here, again, we're still talking about T. If we use the PowerPoint example, Heavenly Tea is a very small producer of chai tea. If the market price is $2, which we established back here, the market price is $2 here, then there we go. Then how would we calculate the producer surplus of each cup of tea produced? What we would do is take the market price, $2. Here we have the $2 market price, and we would need to subtract what they are willing to sell their tea at. So let's do some quick calculations. So for the area A, we would take $2 minus 125, and we would multiply that by 1, and we would get 75 cents. For B, we would take $2, we would subtract $1.50, multiply it by 1 cup, and we would get 50 cents. For area C, $2 minus 175 times 1 cup equals 25 cents. And then you would sum it all together in order to obtain the total producer surplus. Again, producer surplus is the difference between the lowest price a firm is willing to accept and the price it actually receives. Again, total producer surplus in the entire market can be calculated by adding up the producer surplus received in the entire market. So we have shown a upward sloping supply curve, supply of tea here, price $2. Again, it's in a triangular shape this time, and you would still calculate it using 1/2 base times height. So total producer surplus would equal area above the supply curve and below the price. Consumer surplus measures net benefit to consumers from participating in a market rather than total benefit. Producer surplus measures net benefit received by producers from participating in a market. Producer surplus in a market is equal to the total amount firms receive from consumers minus the cost of providing the good or service. Okay. So let's move on to efficiency of competitive markets. We want to think about market efficiency in two ways. A market is efficient if trades take place where marginal benefit exceeds marginal cost and no other trades take place. A market is efficient if it maximizes the sum of consumer and producer surplus. So at economic competitive equilibrium, quantity economic surplus is going to be maximized, or the sum of producer and economic surplus equals the sum of producer and consumer surplus. Okay, remember the demand curve described the marginal benefit of each additional cup of tea, and the supply curve described the marginal cost of each additional cup of tea. One thing I did forget to mention is just like consumer surplus was measured using the demand curve, producer surplus is going to be measured using the supply curve. Again, the supply curve shows at different prices the quantity supplied a producer is willing to supply. And so here we have graphs that show that exact thing. And so that represents the supply curve for Heavenly Tea specifically and for the entire market of chai tea from the producer standpoint. Okay. So economic efficiency here is a market outcome in which marginal benefit to the consumers of the last benefit in which the marginal benefit to consumers of the last unit produced is equal to its marginal cost of production and in which the sum of consumer and producer surplus is at its maximum. So here we have a figure that shows economic surplus in the market for chai tea. We have supply and we have demand and we have the price of $2 here we've talked about. At competitive economic equilibrium, the economic surplus is maximized. So we see here our consumer and producer surplus respectively in blue and red. Two concepts of economic efficiency result in the same level of output. So we went ahead and defined economic efficiency here. And so we see here that we have total maximization of the areas of CS and PS respectively. However, what happens if the market's not in equilibrium, right? So if the price is $2.20 instead of $2, what happens? So we will see, this is our new price, 220. We're going to see changes in producer and consumer surplus. So let's look at areas A, B, C, D, and E. Before we changed the price, areas A, B, and C represented the consumer surplus within the market, while D and E represented the producer surplus because price 2 was our equilibrium price. It was the price at economic efficiency. If we raise the price to $2.20, now what have we done to consumer surplus? Instead of consumer surplus being A, B, and C, consumer surplus is now, again, area below the demand curve and above the price. Consumer surplus, let's go ahead and get my colors here. Is just going to be area A, right? So this area A in blue is going to now represent our new consumer surplus at price 220. So producer surplus is everything above the supply curve but below the price. At price 220, the demand curve tells us that we are going to produce at quantity here. Because again, in order to find the quantity demanded that we are going to demand in this market at price 220, go over to at the price line 220, we find the demand curve and drop straight down. We have quantity 1 here. So what is producer surplus going to be? Producer surplus is going to be areas B and D, everything above the supply curve and below the price. Here in red. So originally, producer surplus was D and E, and now producer surplus has expanded and it's D and B. Okay, so let's go ahead and label that. So what is this strange area that we have going on that is C and D here in yellow? This area is known as deadweight loss. Deadweight loss is the economic surplus resulting from the market not being in economic equilibrium. So economic surplus is going to decrease by some of the areas C and E. Deadweight loss can be also thought of as the amount of inefficiency in the market in competitive equilibrium. Deadweight loss is 0. So remember, at competitive equilibrium, our quantity over here was higher because we were producing at price 2. Price 2 at competitive equilibrium. Now, since we're producing at a higher price in the market and consuming at a higher price in the market, unfortunately, we're going to see a decrease in the amount demanded, and so you won't sell as much from a producer's perspective, and consumers experience a higher price. So consumers' surplus is going to be smaller and producer surplus is going to be greater. So I want to draw out a little bit of a chart. I don't know if I'm going to have room for it, but we're going to try to make room for it. We'll try to do it on the side here. Okay, so at competitive equilibrium, we have, consumer surplus equal to areas A plus B plus C. We have producer surplus equals to area D plus E. However, so at a competitive equilibrium, we have this. We have at $2.20, excuse me, 220. What's our consumer surplus? That's going to be areas A. Our producer surplus is going to be areas B plus D. And our deadweight loss is going to be area C plus E. Again, so how do we figure out what our deadweight loss is? Again, originally we were producing at quantity equilibrium, at competitive equilibrium, because we were at price 2. However, when we raise the price using the demand curve, it tells us that we have to sell at a lower quantity. And the demand curve tells us consumers are only willing to purchase a smaller amount since the price is higher. Okay. So let's go ahead and move on and kind of talking about price ceilings and price floors. So government intervention in the market, price ceilings and price floors. This is one option a government has for impacting the market. Price ceiling is a legally determined maximum price a seller can charge, and a price floor is a legally determined minimum price sellers may receive. Price ceilings and floors in the US are uncommon, but they do include things like minimum wage, rent controls, agriculture price controls. So let's look at a couple examples, the wheat market and the rent market. So in this example, let's say that the equilibrium price for wheat is $6.50 per bushel. I wish it was that high, right? And at this price, 2 billion bushels, these are in billions, are sold. So at price $6.50, we can see here we have a quantity of 2 billion bushels sold. If wheat farmers convince the government to impose a price floor of $8 a bushel, quantity traded is going to fall to 1.8. So at price $8 here, we have a price floor at price $8, the quantity traded is going to fall. So area A is going to be transferred from consumers to producers, again, because A used to be part of consumer surplus because it was above the $6.50 price. But now, since it's below the $8 price, it's going to be a part of producer surplus. Economic surplus overall is going to be reduced by areas B and C. That represents deadweight loss. So the biggest thing I want you to remember when looking at whether something is a price floor or price ceiling is this. If it is a price floor, I want you to think about a bowling ball. A bowling ball that falls to the floor. Okay, so if the bowling ball falls to the floor, it's going to hit the floor and stay there. So price floor means that prices can't go below $8 here. So an effective price floor is going to be set above the market equilibrium price. $8 is greater than $6.50. If the price floor is set below market equilibrium, the bowling ball is going to fall straight down. Let's say the price floor is down here, and it's going to hit equilibrium before it hits the floor, which means price is going to go to equilibrium rather than being stopped by the floor. So a price floor set below market equilibrium is not effective. You need to set, from a government perspective, you need to set the price floor above market equilibrium. Okay? So let's go ahead and I'll try to label this. Remember, B and C is going to be deadweight loss at this new implemented price floor. A is going to be now producer surplus. Also, this area down here is going to be producer surplus as well. And this area up here is going to be the consumer surplus. And this right here is going to be our price floor. So A goes to producers. Again, because that price is higher, it's benefiting the producers, but the consumers lose out, and so consumer surplus decreases, producer surplus increases. This is going to be deadweight loss. This is consumer surplus. This is producer surplus. Okay, so also what are we going to see here when we set a price floor? Our quantity demanded is going to be 1.8, and our quantity supplied is going to be 2.2. Quantity demanded is going to be less than quantity supplied. So we see a surplus in the market as well. So not only do we see an increase in producer surplus and a decrease in consumer surplus, we see a surplus in the market itself because quantity demanded is going to be greater than, excuse me, quantity demanded will be less than quantity supplied. Okay. All right. So now let's move on to a price ceiling example. I know this has been a lot, but we're going to keep going and talk about price ceilings. One thing I do want to mention, sorry, I said we're going to move on to price ceilings, is that if we apply price floors in the labor market, specifically talking about minimum wage, we have the two different arguments and sides of the minimum wage argument. Supporters are going to see it as a way of raising incomes for low-skilled workers. Opponents are going to argue that it results in fewer jobs and imposes large costs on small businesses. Assuming minimum wage does decrease employment, it must result in deadweight loss for society itself. So I would encourage you, if you are interested in that debate and that argument, to go ahead and research it out on your own time. It's very interesting because there are good arguments for both sides. So it is important to make sure you understand, from an economics perspective, both sides of that argument. Okay, so now moving on to rent ceilings. Without rent control, in this example, our equilibrium rent is going to be $2,500 a month. At that price, 2, in this case, million apartments are going to be rented. If the government opposes a price ceiling here of 1,500, what's going to happen? Quantity supplied is going to fall to 1.9, and quantity demanded is going to increase to 2.1. It's going to result in a shortage of 200,000 apartments. So again, let's identify consumer and producer surplus. So with this new implemented price ceiling, we will see consumer surplus increase. So at price 1,500, again, it's everything below the demand curve, above the price. So we will see area A be transferred from producers to consumers. Okay, so this is consumer surplus. A goes to consumers. Okay. And since we're not, again, not at economic equilibrium anymore, we'll see deadweight loss, B and C. And we see a smaller producer surplus down here. Okay, so rectangle A is going to be transferred from landlords to renters. Deadweight loss is going to impact both consumers and producers, and it corresponds to the surplus that would have been derived from apartments that are no longer rented. Again, you see the quantity fall from 2 million to 1.9 million. If we look at our rent ceiling, we have a quantity demanded now at 2.1 and a quantity supplied now at 1.9. Since your quantity supplied is going to be less than your quantity demanded, we're going to see a shortage. Okay. With price ceilings, I want you to think about a balloon floating. So if you think about a balloon floating up, we want an effective price ceiling from the government standpoint to be below market equilibrium, because the price ceiling is a maximum price a seller can charge. If the balloon hits the ceiling before it hits equilibrium, the ceiling is effective. If this ceiling is set above market equilibrium, it's not going to be effective. It'll go to the equilibrium price before it hits the ceiling. So a ceiling set above market equilibrium is ineffective. A floor set below market equilibrium is ineffective. So I want you to think about bowling balls and balloons respectively for price floors and price ceilings. Okay. So one more thing when it comes to rent markets is this shortage in apartments may lead to black market sales, which is a market where buying and selling takes place at prices that violate government price restrictions. Landlords may switch to short-term rentals instead of long-term rentals to avoid rent controls. Airbnb has facilitated this switching, and essentially the use of that market may alleviate some of the deadweight loss by allowing additional apartments to be rented on the side, but buyers and sellers are going to lose legal protections potentially. Keep in mind that there are some municipalities and cities that have decided to put a stop to Airbnb rentals, short-term rentals. An example of this is Amsterdam, and they decided that they didn't want tourists staying in Airbnbs. They wanted tourists staying in actual hotels to promote tourism within their city. Keep in mind, there were some people trying to take advantage of Airbnbs by essentially renting out whole floors of apartment complexes and only using them for Airbnbs rather than actually living in them. And that's part of the reason Amsterdam decided to, hey, do away with this. We want people actually living in the city and actually living in those apartments rather than them just being rented out by a large company, for example, or someone just trying to make a profit on Airbnbs instead of living in the city. So, kind of the summation of government intervention is it's clear that when the government imposes price controls such as price floors and ceilings, some people are better off, some people are worse off. Economy generally is going to suffer because there's going to be some level of deadweight loss. So you can see that in the price floor example, producers are going to benefit. In the price ceiling example, consumers are going to benefit, and both examples experience deadweight loss. Okay. Finally, we got to economic effective taxes. Again, taxes are one of the most important methods the governments fund their activities. This section concentrates on per unit taxes, which are taxes assessed on a particular dollar amount on the sale of a good or service, as opposed to a percentage tax. For example, the gas tax, as of 2019, it was 18.4 cents per gallon. So without a tax, equilibrium is going to occur, in this case, for cigarettes at point A. Equilibrium is $6. Quantity is 4 billion packs. If a $1 per pack tax on cigarettes is imposed, supply curve is going to shift up by $1, and we will see the supply curve shift to price $6.90. $5.90 is the price received by producers after paying the tax. So we have a new equilibrium point at B. Quantity is going to fall to 3.7 billion. Tax increase causes the price paid by consumers to increase. Producers receive a part of that increase, but after paying the tax, they're only left with $5.90. So overall, basically what I want you to understand is that you see there's a tax revenue here, and you also see deadweight loss because of the excess burden from the tax itself. So when government implements a tax, they are capitalizing on not only tax revenue, but there's also deadweight loss within the market. So government revenue equals the green shaded box, consumer surplus and producer surplus becomes tax revenue, and some of it becomes deadweight loss. Okay, again, if you don't understand the economic effect of taxes, don't worry too much about it. Again, it's not going to be heavily tested, but I did want to bring it up for the sake of generally understanding that government intervention does essentially cause deadweight loss in all of these scenarios. So, with that being said, hopefully you have a little bit better understanding of producer and consumer surplus, price floors and ceilings. However, if you have further questions, feel free to let me know.